just horrific racist mass murder in New Zealand of the murders in those two mosques. 50 people are now known to have died. 36 people still in hospital, some of them still fighting for their lives. Some of them very young children. Innocent Muslims simply at prayer in their mosque, gunned down by a horrific mass murderer. One man already charged, 2 others arrested, another woman arrested as well. And he published not only a manifesto justifying the killings, basically talking about white supremacy and killing Muslims, but also it was live streamed on the internet. It shocked the world. But I think what some of us also found quite shocking was the immediate leap to try and use that horrific event for political gain, which happened in the immediate aftermath. Let's talk about this with Brendan O'Neill. He's editor of Spiked Online and has written about this over the weekend. Good morning to you, Brendan.
Hi, Julia.
Brendan, well, I was in the bizarre situation over the weekend of receiving tweets from various people claiming that I was somehow partly responsible for what happened in New Zealand because of things that I've said and written in the past about integration, about the burqa and Muslims in general in this country. Are commentators like myself in any way to blame?
Absolutely not. And I think the argument that people like you or anyone else in this country who simply writes for a living or broadcasts for a living, the suggestion that these people bear any responsibility whatsoever for the horrific racist slaughter in New Zealand, I think is an outrageous argument. And it really is a very grim, cynical attempt to use a deeply horrific act to try to promote censorship. Basically to try to demonize people whose opinions the politically correct set simply don't like, to push them beyond the pale and to say you must stop saying these things or else people will die. I think it is a really awful exploitation of mass murder to try and promote a censorious approach to public discussion.
But the interesting thing is, I mean, as disgusting as I found it as well, and we've seen there's been some articles, I mean, a lady who started the Women's Equality Party, Sophie Walker, has been claiming over the weekend that, well, this is male violence, that's what this is, and we have to blame this on misogyny and the like. And the other claims, of course, again, this is against anyone who's perceived to be right-wing. Again, I don't consider myself to be right-wing or left-wing. I just simply give my own views. But the idea that anyone talking about issues like, AC Grayling, a Remain campaign, blaming Brexit and the discussion about border controls and immigration and how that was partly to blame for this, and it creates an atmosphere where these people feel empowered and legitimised by what's been said. But this is the thing, to exploit this and to try and turn people against each other who are just having civil debate in a democracy, that's exactly what the killer wanted, isn't it?
Absolutely right. And he says that himself in his grim manifesto. Anyone who reads his manifesto will see that he wants to ramp up the race war. He wants to ramp up the conflict between left and right. He wants to stir up the culture wars. And all these people are playing entirely into his hands because they are doing precisely that. They are making these arguments. They are blaming it on everything they simply dislike, whether it's Brexit, whether it's anyone who criticizes radical Islam, whether it's a right-wing columnist or whoever it might be. They are using this attack to score political and in some cases personal points. And that's precisely the response he wanted. He wanted his barbaric assault to have these political ripples across the Western world. So they're doing his bidding for him. The thing I find really chilling about the response to the attack is the way in which it's being used to shut down any discussion whatsoever about tensions in Western society in relation to immigration or Islam or multiculturalism. That kind of discussion is now going to become, I think, increasingly difficult. And that itself is going to store up more and more tensions in society because people will feel they cannot express themselves in an open way.
Well, indeed, my name was on a list with other columnists, like you say, Melanie Phillips and others, who have written about issues like this. And I think in a very careful, deliberately very careful way, so your words cannot be distorted. And also because if you are not yourself, in any, I don't hold racist views. I don't hold any prejudice against anyone of religion. So I wouldn't want to express those views or have them thought of me or on my work. But we were on a list. There are various emails being and lists being shared online of people who need to be shut down, people who should not be allowed to speak because they don't like views. But it strikes me that this killer, and I'm not naming him because I don't want his name to be famous. I think we're doing his work for him. Is that his version of identity politics is just the other side of the same coin of the identity politics we see on the left. So when you can only speak, you're speaking always as a white man. I'm speaking always as a white woman. Middle class, even worse. Someone else speaks as a black man or a Muslim woman or a gay man or a gay woman. People always speaking only from those tiny little boxes of where we come from and how we were born. And when you do that, you create a victim narrative and a separate identity narrative. You are doing his work for him because, of course, his whole white supremacist thing is it's identity politics, and it's also a victim narrative that white men in particular, particularly white people, are somehow victims in society these days, and they need to fight back. He's just the other side of the same coin.
Absolutely. A lot of the commentators who are making these kinds of arguments have blamed this attack on Islamophobia. I think that's the wrong way to view this. I would say this attack was an act of racist bigotry, anti-Muslim bigotry. This was a genuinely racist and bigoted anti-Muslim attack. The problem with calling it Islamophobic is that then folds it into a narrative whereby anything that's critical of Islam becomes Islamophobic. So everything from the newspaper column, which simply says we need to get a grip on radical Islam, right through to this racist assault on and murder of 50 people, everything just becomes something on a spectrum of Islamophobia. I have a real problem with that, real problem with the term Islamophobia, which is so often used simply to control public discussion.
I wanted to ask you about that because I know you've done a recent podcast with Rod Liddell, the Sunday Times columnist, where you've argued, both of you, that Islamophobia is always, it's a made-up word, it's a new thing, but people are using that word to describe, and saying it's akin to, say, anti-Semitism, to describe, as you say, perfectly legitimate comments about Islamic extremism, and about, say, for instance, particular forms of dress, and saying that this is an attack on Muslim people.
That's right, and I think that's it. So Islamophobia has become a very problematic word. It's basically an attempt to demonize anyone who holds particular views on radical Islam especially. And so I have a real issue with the way in which everything is now thrown together. Every single thing you might think or say about radical Islam can be put on a spectrum with this guy who clearly despises Muslims on a very racist level. So the whole thing just creates this incentive to censor and clamp down on anyone whose opinions the correct thinkers simply don't like. I think you're absolutely right that this really does speak to identity politics. What we saw in New Zealand, this massacre, it was a flip reversal of the kind of identity politics we've seen taking hold in the West over the past few years, where he promoted this white identitarianism, this white victim mentality. I think what this attack really speaks to is the danger of defining everyone by their race or their culture or their heritage. I think that creates tension, that creates division, and we can now see it's creating violence. So the argument I would make is let's stop the identitarian bickering and the rehabilitation of racial categories, and let's get back to a kind of humanist politics.
We could just be old-fashioned. We could judge people by what they say and what they do. It'll never catch on, of course. Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online. Thank you very much. Let's very briefly bring in Eric McElroy and Andre Walker on this. Eric, this is the other side of the identity politics coin. Do you not worry that on the left that we are this boxing people into all these different categories is actually a bit dangerous?
Yeah, I think the issue with the area of Islamophobia is that there's a lot of focus on what we don't like in hard fundamentalist Islam, but we don't spend as much time still looking at what's the problem with fundamentalist Christianity, for example. But in the US right now,
except that isn't a worldwide problem with people going around blowing themselves up. And there are a bunch of lunatics in America.
Yes.
But the rest of it, it's not been a problem.
Yeah, but that focus on that only, like the state of Idaho just rejected a law that would have made it illegal to marry 13-year-olds off. You can still marry off a 13-year-old in Idaho. It's disgusting. So the balance of talking about that and those values. So we have hard right or hard views in both faiths.
But except that we are talking about tiny numbers of those sort of far right Christian extremists. It's not coming largely from it's not being preached wide. It's not being preached widely across the world like unfortunately some of this Islamic extremists.
The majority of Muslims aren't on that hard side either.
Not. No, exactly.
And that's what needs to be focused on. And it's not. That's
but we are seeing wars across the world, and we are seeing terror attacks across the world caused by one particular form of that extremism. And Andre Walker, I'm going to have to ask you about this because you're a supporter of Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is a despicable, appalling man. I think I know he's a racist. Some of the things he said, we're going to stop all Muslims, a ban on Muslims entering America. If that isn't a racist, Islamophobic statement, I don't know what is. And then he has the cheek to say he's very sad about what happened in New Zealand.
Well, I assume he is very sad about what happened in New Zealand. Look, I support.
Care less?
Look, the travel ban, which I don't necessarily support it, but Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. You could perfectly easily come to America after the travel ban. The travel ban was solely related to those countries that do not assist the United States of America with vetting, and that to me seems reasonable.